Dante and Jamie, and today we're at Ursula Franklin Academy in Toronto taking Degrassi group chats on the road.
We're going to be talking with some students to hear what they have to say about violence and safe spaces. Let's go.
Let's do it.
Okay, so in season 4, it is seen that there is a terrorist attack that strikes in Belgium, and I think it affects the whole world, including Degrassi. The subway shuts down in Toronto, and the whole school is wearing "We Support Belgium" t-shirts, which leads us to this group chat where we want to talk about safe spaces and what seeing these images and seeing everything going on in the world, like how it affects you.
So I see kind of like two major issues when it comes to like mass violence and terrorism in the world, and they're sort of like different ends of a spectrum. So I see desensitization at one end, where we are just like, violence is just so normalized in our society that not only does it like exist in our everyday lives, but we sort of lose a bit of compassion for the things that happen, especially if they aren't like geographically or culturally close to our homes. And then at the other end, I see this like fear that we've talked about, where everybody's just constantly afraid of what could happen to them, or like they feel like there's no way to protect themselves, and that's where you see a lot of sort of like racism and xenophobia coming in, because people are afraid of things that they feel are beyond their control, so they try and find something that they can control.
I think that in terms of dealing like with it like personally, it can be a bit hard, especially when you're like growing up, like seeing all these things on social media and on the news. It can be a bit hard to, I guess, to know how to deal with it. Because a lot of that comes from the fact that we sort of have to learn how to do that by ourselves. Like we don't, like I know even in our school at least, we don't really talk about these things that much unless they happen like in Canada. I can remember one time when there was a terrorist attack on a mosque in Quebec, I think it was, where it was on the announcements in school, and like there was a little bit of time to discuss it. But I think it's difficult for us to know how to unpack those sort of things and to know how to deal with it. And I think that's where a lot of the things come from also, like what you said about like knowing where they come from, but also like knowing how to deal with them.
You know, I live up in the suburbs, so for me, it's not something that's prevalent in my day-to-day life, but I do come downtown a lot, and I ride public transit, and I'm always, you know, in very crowded areas. And I find that there's always that fear in the back of your head. And, you know, unfortunately, there has been some pretty major terrorist attacks in the past few months, specifically the one, unfortunately, on the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. And for some reason, that was the one that really kind of hit really close to home for me. I don't know how you guys reacted to that or felt.
Yeah, so I definitely feel like the reason, I mean, terrorism and the groups that we discussed too, their primary targets are other Muslims, if we're speaking about terrorism of people from the Middle Eastern countries. But that doesn't gain coverage because, you know,
it's outside of our scope.
It's also the other, in the sense that even though England is a different country, it's still this tribe of the Western world, and so there's like a similarity in culture, and so people can relate and they tend to be more personally affected by it.
I definitely agree, and I also think it's really hard to separate identity from a lot of these like terrorist attacks that we've seen. I know last year when the Pulse thing happened, and it affected a lot of my friends and I like really personally, because it was like motivated by homophobia and it was motivated by racism. Like Pulse was like primarily like Black and Latinx like club, I guess, right? So as a lesbian Latina, it was like, I guess, I don't know, it's sort of eye-opening, and it hit home exactly. So when I went to Pride later in the month, it hadn't actually occurred to me until my friend like brought it up, but we were worried like, oh, like Pride has like been safe in Toronto, but will it be this year? Like if it happened in Orlando, like will it happen in Toronto?
Yeah, I find definitely that's something that, you know, it seems irrational to have a fear of terrorism, especially when you look at statistics about how unlikely you are to be a victim of it, and how really it is an irrational fear. But that's kind of the point of terrorism, is that that's what it feeds off of, is creating irrational fear in people, and that's how it works, right? Because they don't have to kill too many people, it's just enough to incite that kind of fear and heartbreak in people.
Also, something else that's like effective about it is like, even if you get over the fear that it will happen to you, it's still like, so like just sad. It's like the hopelessness and the desperation, like, you know, there's nothing you can do to stop it, where like for some other issues you're like, oh, I can help in this way, I can donate, I can do activism, but with terrorism, you just watch it happen. You watch the news and you check your social media and you see all the reports come in, but you just have to sit there.
So you mentioned the idea of social media and its kind of relation to terrorism, and how do you think that that kind of contributes to the Western world's fear?
So on Facebook, for example, you have like that trending list, what's trending. And the thing is that it's clickbait in the sense that the things that will make us angry or the things that will make us scared, they get the most attention. And currently we live in an attention economy, is what it's been called. So everyone's fighting for your attention, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Facebook, because then you're going to be there longer, you're going to see the ads. Social media, it activates those parts of your like habit pathways in your brain that like, oh, I'm not an expert, but
I did my thesis on this.
Yeah,
so dopamine is a drug that releases like happiness cells. It's the same thing that you get from like alcohol, sex, and like nicotine and all that stuff. So social media, the immediate reactions that you get online is like essentially the same. Like when you get a like on Facebook or like on Instagram.
Adrenaline maybe.
Adrenaline, exactly. It's the same thing. It activates like that kind of like drug in your brain and it becomes addictive. So yeah.
And I definitely think that, you know, it's more profitable for people to focus on the negative things in the world.
And I think a lot of, I think you may have touched on this a little bit, but I think a lot of the way we approach the things happening in the world can be affected by the way it's like given to us. And especially on social media when like it's all dependent on those like one sentence headlines. Like
we have very short attention spans now, so we won't read the full article.
Yes, but also in that one like sentence like summary, I guess, it's hard to get like the full grasp of the issue, like Dia was saying.
It's also really hard because a lot of the news that we're like receiving here in our like area of privilege, I guess, is very, very like biased towards what is relevant to us. Like for example, the Manchester terrorist attack. Like I think it was mainly relevant because it, like here we're all fans of like Ariana Grande or know who she is and stuff like that. Often you don't hear about news that target groups that aren't necessarily, like I don't want to say irrelevant to us here, but you don't really hear about like the terrorism that's going on in like other regions of the world that may not be relevant to us. For example, like I didn't really hear about stuff that's going on in my home country. Like I'm half Filipino and I didn't know about half the terrorism that's going on there. But there's this huge issue there and I had no idea about it because it wasn't in any of the mainstream news. I didn't see it on Snapchat, like the news that they had there. I didn't see it in the Daily Mail. I didn't see it on Facebook. But all I heard about was stuff that was relevant here. So I think it's very hard because it's really filtered towards like what we think is important.
And sort of just going back to like exactly what you're saying about it's sort of like state-sponsored terrorism is or seen as like war, and that's seen as okay, whereas like individual like vigilante groups or whatever are seen as terrorist groups. So you don't hear when governments are doing things to their citizens, but you do hear when the citizens are sort of like retaliating back. And that can be really scary as well, and you're also sort of not informed about the things that are going on.
Like this is the point that always gets brought up, but when we talk about terrorism committed by white people, where you always like talk about their like personal history, and we're always talking about like how good a person they were and stuff like that. And, like
mental health too.
Their mental health, but we always talk about like if they have mental health issues and stuff like that. We don't go into what everyone was saying about the root cause, about like that it was motivated by like whatever hatred or whatever like root cause. The way we talk about it is super telling of like our perspectives of like you said, groups of people in the world. Like we'll be a lot faster to call like ISIS terrorism than we will to be like, I don't know, terrorism by white people in America or in Canada.
We hear instantly about like attacks and stuff in like Canada, the US, even like England. We also get like so much positive news about like things that are going on like in our government or like just like happy things that are happening, because there are a lot of those. But when it comes to like anywhere else in the world, basically we only hear about the terrorism and the like negative things and things that are like really, really like newsworthy and will make headlines. And then that contributes to like prejudice and like all the like misconceptions that we have, and it shows up here, like even in our school community. So it's, I think, like more positivity like from other like parts of the world.
Well, it's external that needs to come, because
we need to hear
I mean,
about
there's
it.
specific regions in the world that unfortunately are going through difficult times, and we do only hear the negative because there is a lot of negative going on, but I feel like we are never really well versed in the positive that might be going on there. So there might be kind of setbacks that are happening, but we're never really made aware of the advancements.
I actually had a pleasant surprise on my Facebook wall the other day. There was a video about this guy in, I think, a village in India somewhere, where feminine hygiene products are extremely stigmatized. So I think 5% of women use them. But he went on and made this machine that was affordable that you can install in your community to make these napkins, and he's like helping all these women. And I think that something like that, like, why don't we hear more about that? That's so cool.
Exactly. It's really good to have positive news like that, like thrown in every now and then, because I think in general it's just kind of just calms us down, makes us realize like where we're at, and like that, yes, although like terrorism is a thing and it's happening, that like we are very lucky to be living where we are living.
And even though, unfortunately, we are faced with all this conflict and all this negativity that we see constantly propelled in front of us on the headlines, there is so much good and so much advancement coming out of the world that we live in that's overshadowed by the fact that people want us to be afraid and want us to, you know, be in fear and constantly worrying to either, you know, get views or sell newspapers or whatever it is, that we kind of forget that we're actually in a very progressive time that's really come a long way since the olden days.
Yeah, and I almost feel like we're conditioned to think that bad news is more important than positive news. So like a negative is worth more than a positive. Like that story I told, like if I told you now a bad story about some murder or something, wouldn't that stick with you more than the first story I told you, and you'd feel overall worse coming out of that situation, not better about humanity.
I think an issue that our generation has, maybe because we are flooded with so much of the terrible things that are going on in the world, is a lot of people, especially when they're entering the workforce, are struggling with this I want to make a difference right away. In like older generations, or like my parents, they knew that like in order to make a difference in your career, you had to get established, whereas today you'll have like 25-year-olds who are quitting their job after like 6 months because they don't feel like they're having an impact on the world. And that can contribute to this feeling of being overwhelmed, because you don't have as much like belief that if you wait it out or if you like follow this one path, then things will get better. It's just like there's so many things that are going on and I have to do them all right now. And when that doesn't happen, because it can't happen overnight, you feel really hopeless.
So in light of all the violence and like the terrorism and the things that we're talking about, do you at school and in your school community have places where you can go and talk about it, like a safe space or clubs or even courses that kind of let you have discussions about this kind of stuff?
We have so much at Ursula Franklin Academy, seeing as we're a social justice school. Everything kind of revolves around that, just being like safe as a student at our school. So we have a bunch of like safe spaces. So we have Young Women's Discussion, which kind of like covers all the topics that like women face on a daily basis, or girls. And then we have SAS, which is like we talked about before. It's a safe space for sexuality and like sexual expression. And then we have Culture Club, which is a club where you can just express your ethnic background or your race and your culture, and that's a safe space there. And also we have a course called Gender Studies at our school, which talks about kind of like things that we should be educated on in terms of gender, sexual expression, and who you are as a person, how you identify yourself and represent yourself, and how you're seen in the media too. We talk about that a lot. So we're really well versed here at Ursula Franklin Academy. So.
But as for dealing with like terrorist attacks and like violence around the world, I found personally that there isn't much room to speak about that. I mean, unless it happened in Canada, like I said earlier, we don't generally like talk about it in class. Like sometimes in my anthro course, we'll talk about it just like in the first 15 minutes of class. But there's not really a space, I think, devoted to just like conversations about that.
I think we like try pretty hard to make like safe spaces within our school about like school issues. Like we try to make our school feel safe for the students that go there, but we don't really discuss like a lot of outside issues as much as we could, like especially like terrorism and violence.
Yeah, I think the main course where we talk about it is in like genocides and crimes against humanity, because that's what the course is about. It sort of talks about like state-sponsored terrorism mostly. And that's a course that has like helped me sort of understand violence a lot more and like come to peace with it in a productive way.
So how do you think going forward as, you know, the newer generation, I guess you could say, and we're kind of paving the way for the future with also incorporating social media and stuff, how do we kind of change the conversation?
Educate yourself. It starts getting to the point, especially with this whole phenomenon of fake news and all of that. I think that we have a lot of information at our disposal, almost too much, and it makes people feel like they can't find the right answer or real facts. There are journalists out there who are working their butts off every day to get us the right information and to frame the conversation in a good way, and we should be listening to them. And I feel like that's the first step.
Totally.
Yeah, I hate to be the one to like quote Ursula Franklin, but like, but like being personally happy and publicly useful is so like the goal in life, I think, for everyone. And it's just like finding that balance of working to end these issues that are going on in the world, but making sure that you realize that you can't do that if you are not personally happy in yourself. And like being happy and making those around you happy is also making the world a better place. And focusing on little ways that people can help and the people that are helping and showcasing those stories, I think is really like inspiring and helpful.
Also, just like thinking critically, not only about like what you're reading, but also how you're interpreting it. Like, why did I immediately think this? Taking note of why you're interpreting things the way that you are. When we have such a like limited understanding of why things happen, it like contributes to the prejudice and the like divide that like actually is the problem. So it makes things like this happen even more. So it's like really counterproductive, like to just like make assumptions about other backgrounds and countries and places in the world.
People would like to not think about these things, but if you study these instances of atrocities and you look at what underlies these issues and you start to recognize common patterns, you really find out a lot more about humanity, and it helps you on a day-to-day basis with other acts of violence.
Yeah, it's like if there's no cause, there can't be a solution. So when
Yes.
you learn like what's happening, you see how you can prevent that and make it better.
I feel like one of the biggest steps towards making these issues, like I guess, less prevalent in our society and occur less is understanding first. Understanding is the huge step, and just after understanding why these things happen is how you can start to like target what to fix in our society in order to prevent those from ever happening again. Because if you can understand it and help, then it won't ever happen again, or hopefully not.
So thank you for contributing to the conversation. You guys are all awesome, and keep being those little social justice warriors, and hopefully we can kind of take what we discussed into the circle further out into the world. So yeah, and again, this was Degrassi Group Chats.